Thank you for having me. My name is Kristen Dotti, and I am with the company Catalyst Learning Curricula in the United States, where we do training and exploration of curriculum development for next generation science standards and STEM education for teachers to teach using hands-on methods. And the presentation I want to discuss today is how to guide students to do a student design experiment so that they are acting as scientists in the classroom at all times. Rather than the teacher talking about doing science, we want to have them do science each time they're in the class. Whether it's a virtual class or an in-person class, I'm going to show you a method that you can reproduce. And the technique I'm going to use today is to have students do science by immediately being in contact with a phenomenon, something of interest to them, something that captivates them and gives them some data acquisition time. So what I've done as an example for you to see this is I have set up an experiment where I've created a data table in Google Sheets so that you can see my students are all listed on the left side. And I'm going to have them do some trials of data collection so that they can pull information together where they're playing with a particular phenomenon. In this case, I had them create a pendulum, and I want them to be able to make something that they can put their hands on that's safe and that is intriguing, but they can do this at home, or they can do it at their desk without touching in this environment. If I was in the classroom, I might have supplies in the room, but at home, this is perfectly fine. They can use what they have. Maybe they just have some string and some object at the end, or they're using a shoelace or something that they find at home. It doesn't matter that they have different items. In fact, it's actually wonderful to have the variation, because in a virtual environment, the students will see each person swinging a different object. And we want to look at this phenomenon and try to determine what is impacting the phenomenon, what is making the oscillations back and forth change. And so I don't want you to be distracted by the fact that this is a physical science example. You can take any example of phenomenon in biology, chemistry, physics, earth science, and use anything that's intriguing to get the students to generate data. So as you can see in this data collection spreadsheet, I have put together my students some trial information, as well as modeling the types of calculations I expect them to do. You would have whatever calculations are appropriate for your grade level. If you're teaching a 4th grade, you might have a different calculation than an 11th or 12th grade student, where you need to do more sophisticated data analysis. And eventually they're going to use the information on the right side of observations and factors. So I'm going to make this larger now so that we can see it more easily. But my students would be collecting preliminary information before they came to class on this left side. So they would have tried out their little apparatus when they came to class, or maybe within the first couple of minutes. I would ask them to count how many oscillations per minute so that they get a full swing. An oscillation is 1, 2, 3. I'm not going to go into a deeper explanation with my students. I simply want them to have enough information so that they can begin collecting data. And as they collect data, I want them to go ahead and start putting their data into the data sheet so that the rest of the class during class can see that they're all there actively participating. This gets a large level of engagement for my students, but it also allows them to make the comparisons that your brain will naturally want to make. My students will look at their numbers and their friends, and they will see the different things that are happening in the window as they look at the other people's objects, and they will wonder why their numbers are different from their friends. So that natural curiosity is going to drive this participation and interaction, but it's also going to drive questions. They're going to wonder, why is mine different than theirs? Is there something that can account for that? And as they do their next trials, they're able to see that they're getting data that may be consistent for themselves, but inconsistent between their other people in their class. So I'm using the phenomenon and the data collection to allow my students to build curiosity. And when they build curiosity, they're going to be more interested in the topic that I need to cover for my class. So I'm getting them to be interested in the content that I know I'm going to cover for my class, but I want them to be interested for their own measures, their own reasons. So the next step that I would do with my students is I would ask them to make 5 observations. I would ask them to use their own name and go along the line of their name so that they can put their observations across from their name in their own space. And I would ask them to make different observations and include them on the chart so that each observation is in a different part of the chart, each across the row. And the observations that I would ask my students is to make factual observations or claims about the data. They might use their own data line. They might use the data from the entire group, or they might use some of the tabulations that are done in the averages or the standard deviation, whatever's in the chart that I've included. And so what you'll see is students will begin to put information into their row, and it won't happen all in the same place in the same time. But as a student begins to put their information into the row, other students feel encouraged that they need to say something. And maybe they don't know what to say. Maybe they don't know exactly what the teacher wants, but they can see what the other students are saying and get the prompt from their peers. This allows them to feel each other and know that they're working together, even if they don't have the direct support of a teacher answering the question or standing right by them. So there's a sense of collaboration. And as a teacher, I might move this to be a broader view so that I can see what's happening for the whole class. I can see who's participating, and I can prompt or ask students who are hesitant to join us. So I have this one student here, Bren, who has not put any information in, and I can see that the other students have put information in. So I might send an email or private message to her to say, do you need help? Is there something I can do to help you join us? Because the peers already are moving forward. After my students have put some claims in, I can see that their claims sometimes do not have any data for support. And so what I'm going to ask my students is to add 3 additional observations. So they've already put in 5, or maybe they're not there yet, but I'm prompting them because I have some that have already put 5 in. So I asked them to put 3 additional observations in because I want them to look more closely. For my students, the first 3 or 4 things they say might be very easy, but I want them to actually take a closer look at the data. So then I say, okay, 3 more. And that always frustrates them because they have to look much more closely to get 3 or more observations, right? After that, I will ask them to look at their observations and add numeric support, evidence to each claim. So if they say that the averages were higher after this time, I say, ask them, what number could you put there to support that statement? And so they have to go back into their observations and they have to enhance those observations by putting numeric support. So you can see that there are numbers in a lot of these claims to support what they have said. And we don't have the time for me to read these to you or you to look at them very detailed, but I will zoom in for just a minute just to see that each student has along their line some different claims. The claims might be very basic. They might be more astute. They might be seeing some good patterns, some good trends, and each student is going to differentiate. They're going to come at this the way they are. If they understand more easily the data, they will make better observations and maybe some better, broader ideas. I do want them all to know how to make an observation with evidence, a claim with evidence support. And so I'm going to push that as my agenda for as a teacher, but my students will come where they are. The other thing I want to point out at this point is that when students are working with a large set of numbers, it's very overwhelming. Adults have a hard time with a lot of numbers as well. But if the students have collected those numbers by themselves, they have a personal relationship to the numbers they're using, and it's more understandable. So I would always suggest bring the data from the student, let them bring the data to the class. Instead of you giving them the data set, let them work with data that is familiar and is personal. So they have the ability to understand what those numbers might mean in context. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to move over on the data set from the observations, and we're going to build on an explanation. Why do we see these differences between your pendulum and my pendulum? What is the difference in the data? Why do we see the numbers changing? Now, the students can see the obvious things. These are different materials. But when we get down to it, the question I'm going to ask as a science teacher is, what factors impacted this phenomenon? And that question could be asked no matter if you're working with a biology, an environmental science, a physics question. It makes no difference. That question, what factors impact this phenomenon, can be answered in a similar way by saying, where's the variation? So again, I'm going to ask each student to take their own row and answer this question along their row by putting in their observations or their explanation, of what factors might impact the phenomenon. So this student has said, maybe it's how high you drop the object. And another student says, oh, that's a good idea, I'm going to put that too. Or they can come up with their own ideas. Maybe one student noticed that their object was twirling and they think that slowed it down or sped it up. And as you go through, each student is going to talk about different things, the mass on the bottom of the string or the shape of the object, and they're each putting information into their line. So I'm going to make this smaller so that it's more obvious what's happening, but I'm going to show you how the students would fill their data sheet with explanations. And so they're talking about all of the things they think are impacting this phenomena, the pendulum, the length of the string, the shape of the object, whether or not there was wind, whether or not the angle was higher or lower, whether it got pushed or bumped. Some students might talk about techniques like counting error or the setup. And so you're going to see the students, again, are going to add what is appropriate for their brain and their development. They're going to differentiate. They may come at it with a more sophisticated point of view or a less sophisticated point of view, but that's up to the student. What we want is for them to engage their brain and participate on that level. And once the students have put in all of their information, I will at some point stop them. You can see that they don't have an equal participation as students do. And I will ask them to look for similarities in their data, in their factors. And so they will look through and read their peers' ideas. And then I would ask them to code them based on similarities. So if one student says, oh, I put the mass of the object, how much it weighs, as possibly impacting the phenomenon, I ask all the students to pick a color and use that same color. So if they choose the color yellow, then every student is going to turn that same choice yellow. So all of these students have mentioned that same factor. If I say, okay, what's another factor that you mentioned that somebody else also said, they will pick another one and say, oh, we did this one the same. Okay, everyone turned that one red, or another one green, and so on. Until finally we can see that there are many factors that are repeated by peers, but there are a lot of individual and interesting ideas as well. Eventually, we will have all of the factors color-coded so that they can see how many different factors may be impacting the phenomenon. At that point, I want them to think about all those different factors and realize that each one of those factors is an individual experiment. Every one of those factors could be an independent variable that you can manipulate while you hold all the other factors still, and you control the factors that you're not manipulating, and you can use them to experiment in an individual data collection. So I have taken each of the different colors and color coded them so that the yellow experiments are all the same color, the orange, and so on. And you can see in this small class of 18 students, we came up with 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 12 different concepts that could be explored as individual experiments. So I want my students to then take an idea and go do that experiment, but make sure all the other factors are held steady and controlled so that they're only manipulating one variable at a time. Whether this is physical science or we're using this to explore the respiratory system or to explore the oceans and acidification, it doesn't make any difference. The process is the same. Get the students doing something immediately, have them collect data that's personal, that shows a phenomena or an aspect of what you plan to teach, and then ask them to look at the data closely, make observations for trends, patterns that help break down the data and look for those variations. The more variations, the better. That makes them more curious. You don't want it to all look the same. In my classroom, my students often make the mistake of thinking we all have the same materials. The teacher told us the same procedure, and so we must all have the same data. And that's not true at all. At home, it makes it much easier to see that there's variation in so many ways. And that way, when they start to do experiments, they try to control for those variations. This could be repeated in any grade level. You can have very young students starting this. And the more often they do it, the more often they understand how to control variables, how to manipulate variables, and what we're looking at when we look at data. That is the presentation I want to give. And so if you have any questions, I would love to hear that and help you with anything that could be used to clarify how to do this in your own classroom.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kristen, Dotti, for your meaningful presentation on the topic of in a virtual or in-person class, including very amazing data. So far, we have got some questions from our participants. So I would like to read the participant question for you. So the first question is from Viret. His question is, I am wondering how to organize this activity dealing with students' misconceptions in science concepts. How do you organize peer support among students?
So the students are not all going to be at the same level when you start or when you finish. And so what you're looking for is to introduce students to a phenomenon, a scientific concept, a process. And as they approach it, maybe they have a better background and more places to contextualize what they're understanding. And you can help advance all students by making sure that they're addressing the information personally and asking you questions about what's disturbing or strange to them. So one student might say, I'm not sure how gravity is working the same on the different masses. And another student is not ready for that concept of gravity and mass. And therefore, they're going to ask a different question. So it's really important that the students have a forum, a place to ask questions, and the teacher is receptive to their questions, not to what their own agenda is as a teacher. Yes, we must cover our content, but if we're not paying attention to who's in front of us and the problems that they have, we'll never see their misconceptions if we're not asking them to speak with us. And so a lot of it is about participating between the teacher and the student and not having that authoritative classroom where only the teacher speaks and only the teacher tells you what they're going to learn. You need to have that receptive classroom where the child can tell you what they need next, and that way you can address misconceptions as they arise. In terms of difficulty in getting on an online platform, yes, we always have problems with accessibility. And so recording the session and asking students to participate, sometimes they don't have a camera, they might need other access. And so the more versatile you are as a teacher in a virtual classroom by recording and having access to something online that's at a different time. I have so many students who the timing doesn't work. They can't get on the computer at the same time because their brother is on class too, or the internet is not working in that moment, but maybe in another hour. So being versatile as a teacher and being good with your technical skills is really helpful.
So thank you so much for your answer. And you also have some more questions waiting for you to answer, and you also have around 6 minutes more to answer this question. So the next
Okay.
question is from Chaim Kim San. So she would like you to give her some simple teaching techniques for Cambodian teachers for helping students to get a deep understanding about science classes that they do not have enough experience, equipment for testing.
So that's an excellent question. I've never worked at a school that has had any money. And so it's always about scrambling for those materials. And what I've found is that science is everywhere, it's all around us. And so, for instance, right now in this one moment without equipment, I can test my blood, my heart rate just here with my 2 fingers. I could look out the window and count how many bird species I see in terms of diversity or abundance. I could be looking at a phenomenon such as the sound of the air conditioning in this room or the heater and use my cell phone as a decibel meter or a light meter or any type of app that I have access to. So what I ask my students is, what is here? What phenomena is here? What do you see? Let's use that. What equipment do we have right now? Oh, I have my cell phone, or I have this pen. I'm going to use what we have. And it doesn't have to be fancy. My background is in molecular genetics. We can't do that in my classroom. I'm not expecting my students to do DNA analysis in my classroom. Instead, I want them to look at what they can see, which is genetic traits or the similarity and differences through patterns of variation. And that is all observable. It's all right there. And so I would say, keep it cheap, keep it simple, because most of the phenomena that children are curious about is what they have observed anyway, and not necessarily a high-tech version of that. Don't be dissuaded by the fact that we don't need fancy, expensive equipment. We can do some really good science with our own brains and our eyes.
So thank you very much for your answer. And here come another question from Pain Chamran. What teaching method and strategy do you use it for students who love learning science?
To me, most of the students who love learning science want to be doing science. And so my emphasis is on doing science. If you're familiar with the next generation science standards or any of the historic standards, honestly, in almost every country, science for the last 50 years has always been encouraging teachers to do science. Don't talk about science, do science. And my most passionate students want me to let them do science. They don't want me to talk at them. They want to do the action. So when we talk about something, I try to keep it very brief. If you notice, I didn't stop and say, here's the terminology, pendulum oscillation, here's how we're going to use all of these fancy words, and here's a lecture, take your notes, do your PowerPoints. That's not science. Science is about action and making advances based on the collection of facts, trends, and patterns. And so I want my students to get in, get dirty, and get to it themselves. I can always correct their course. I don't need to tell them what to do first. Just keeping them safe and helping them keep themselves safe is my number one way of guiding them.
So thank you very much. And it should be the last question for you in the session. Maybe the follow-up question from Chaim Kim San again. So what should a teacher do if some students seem not to like learning in science classes?
That's a tough one because we all have preferences. I was never a big history person myself, but I, of course, had to do history. So we're going to have differences, and maybe accepting that instead of admonishing is really the first place to start, that we're all going to have preferences, and maybe you don't like this class as much as another class. But what is it that intrigues you? And maybe they're intrigued more by the numbers, or maybe they want to do more data programming. And so we do a project that is science oriented, but allows them to do some computer programming. Or maybe I can pull them in by saying, look, every experiment we do, we're going to customize it. So when we're doing the heart rate experiment, and I ask you what factors impact the rate of someone's heart is pumping, you are interested in meditation, and so you're going to do meditation and talk about that with heart rate. But he is interested in physical exercise, and he's going to do his experiment on a different topic on heart rate still, but physical exercise. And this other person who's interested in animals is going to be petting the animal to see if that changes their heart rate. So we can ask students to come to our subject, our agenda, with their own interests and their own relevance, and tell us how they can make this agenda that I have as a teacher relevant to their own life because of their own interests. And that's going to help them understand that together we're learning, not just me. I'm not here just to teach my own class, but I'm bringing those 30 students with me, and they have to be a contributing factor. So that's my, let them join you so that they have more interest.
Yeah, thanks so much for your clear explanation and answer to the question. I am pretty sure that this presentation as well as question and answer would be useful for our audience. Because of time constraint, we could not answer all questions that have been dropped in the chat box. So let us sorry for that. And the rest question would be answered in the forum. So thank you so much, Kristen, Dotti, for your sharing today. And so here come to the end of your presentation. Thank you so much.